The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I want to reinforce what the Honourable Phil Goff has said in respect of facilitation payments. Mr Chairman, I think it beggars belief that we have got ourselves into the position under this legislation that we don't cover off and prohibit facilitation payments. Mr Chairman, the influence of countries like New Zealand can either be positive in the world or negative or neutral. I like to think that we are a country that should uphold high standards and help other countries get their standards to be better by doing the right thing from New Zealand and encouraging improvement in standards in those countries. Sir, Transparency International are quite right. David Clendon's supplementary order paper ought to be supported by this House. If the government does not support that supplementary order paper, why? Are they saying that the United Kingdom's got it wrong, that other countries that are banning facilitation payments have got it wrong? Mr Chairman, as the Honourable Phil Goff has said, what is illegal in New Zealand is illegal because it's improper. Small bribes are improper and ought to be illegal. Mr Speaker, can I address a couple of other issues that I would like commentary from the Minister on? The first relates to the narrow definition of a foreign public official. Mr Chairman, you will be aware that there is current controversy that the Auditor-General is looking into as to whether the payments that were made to the Al Khalaf Group by the New Zealand government amounted to improper payments. It's notable that the people to whom those payments were made, who exerted influence on whether Saudi Arabia acceded to a free trade agreement in the Gulf, were not themselves public officials, but they were people of influence in Saudi Arabia who could block a free trade agreement. Mr Speaker, in my opinion, the definition of who New Zealanders should not be able to pay facilitation payments or bribes to needs to be wider than the narrow definition of foreign public official that is currently in the legislation. And I think it's wrong that we in this Parliament have so narrow a definition that we would not catch the sort of payments that we have been concerned about in respect of the Saudi farm debacle. Mr Speaker, in that instance, we had a very powerful person in Saudi Arabia who was disaffected with first the Labor government and then the national government for having a ban on the export of live sheep to Saudi Arabia. That person was a close friend of the then Minister of Agriculture in Saudi Arabia, and there's no doubt that he has made speeches that are a matter of public record to say, well, why should New Zealand come wanting a free trade agreement, and why should he cooperate with New Zealand getting a free trade agreement in Saudi Arabia when, from his perspective, New Zealand was blocking the export of live sheep for slaughter to Saudi Arabia. Now, he made his protestations clear to the Labor government, and we said no, we disagree. We're going to regulate for what we think is the right thing in New Zealand. We're going to ban that. The current national government might have created impressions they were going to go differently. They probably did. But in the end, the current national government said they would renew those bans on the export of live sheep to slaughter, which was their sovereign right in New Zealand to do it, and we actually think they made the right decision. But this disaffected businessman was blocking the advancing of free trade arrangements with Saudi Arabia to the detriment of the New Zealand trading relationship. That does not justify that person being paid off. That's what the Auditor-General is looking into at the moment, as to whether the allegation, which I think is made out on the papers, is that's the true underlying nature of these payments that were made. A $7 million upfront payment to the Al Khalaf Group, which didn't buy $7 million of value, was actually paid in order to buy the influence of that person to stop them blocking advancing free trade with New Zealand. Mr Speaker, that sort of payment is proper, and yet this improper, and yet this piece of legislation does not cover it, because the definition of the foreign public official in Saudi Arabia is too narrow, and only applies to people who are effectively public servants rather than people, other people who can exercise influence over those public servants. So, sir, again, in addition to the point that's made by Transparency International that the Honourable Phil Goff has made, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is that point as to why this legislation does not go far enough. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I think New Zealand is facing more pressures relating to corruption both within the country and outside than we used to. It's partly a consequence of the world becoming a more competitive, ruthless place. It's also partly a consequence of some of the different norms, if I could put it that way, of some of the more recent immigrant populations that have come to New Zealand. Now, that is not to call all immigrants corrupt. It is not to call immigrants corrupt, but it is true. What's that? Well, actually, if you don't want to face the reality that there are higher levels of corruption in India and China than there are in New Zealand, then, Mr. Seymour, you are naive. It is true that there are higher levels of corruption in countries like that than there are in New Zealand, and we've got to be very, very careful that we push against those practices becoming prevalent in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, I have those comments made to me by senior members of the business community in Auckland, and these are pressures that we in this Parliament must guard against. We must guard against. The vast majority of immigrant populations from all countries, including India and China, are good people. But there are exceptions. Yeah, Russia is another example where there are corrupt practices that are more prevalent in those countries than we want to be prevalent here. We've got to guard against those sorts of conduct becoming prevalent in New Zealand, including when we have trading relationships that are from New Zealand into those countries, and that's why this sort of legislation is absolutely important, so that we push against those sorts of practices becoming prevalent in New Zealand. Just in the last couple of weeks, we had the example reported in the newspapers, and this goes to Clause 5 of the bill, which relates to the trafficking in persons, where someone in New Zealand was passed a note by someone from a eastern country saying that this person was effectively being held in servitude in the prostitution industry and her rights were being abused. Now, Mr. Chairman, I hate it when I read those sorts of things. I want our government officials and our police and our customs and immigration people to have all of the powers that they need to push against that sort of reprehensible behaviour where people are exploited and they are effectively held in servitude. I was somewhat dismayed to see the response of the police to that. They wouldn't even actually go in there and investigate the allegation, despite the fact that a New Zealander, at a considerable risk to his own reputation, given that he had been visiting a brothel, actually said that he had been passed a note to say that by a person in that brothel to say that that person was being exploited, having been brought in from an eastern country. Mr. Speaker, that sort of thing happens more often in New Zealand than it used to. It's not as prevalent as it is in overseas countries, but it does happen. The OECD has pointed out that they cannot believe that New Zealand is so free of corruption that we have never had a prosecution of a New Zealand business person in New Zealand accused of bribery of overseas officials. They say that it is unbelievable that even in this clean country like New Zealand, that we have never had occasion to find out and root out the low levels of corruption that we do have. Mr. Speaker, for those reasons, I want the Minister to answer why we have such a narrow definition of public official in respect of who can be paid bribes, because we're effectively saying other people can be paid bribes, just not foreign public officials, as narrowly defined in this legislation. And I also want to hear why the Minister believes that Transparency International, the UK, and indeed the UN Convention is wrong in respect of facilitation payments.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Amy Evans.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I did want to take a call on this main part of the Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Bill and just bring us back to the